If we look at the labor market pressures, and essentially the baby boom cohort is one that is not yet in their 80s. And most of the baby boomers, in fact, are the late boomers, and they're still very much in the workforce. For the last 12 years or so, what we've seen is that starting of the retirement of the early boomers, which are now exiting or have exited the workforce. And we've seen that reflected in terms of labor market pressures. And when I talk to folks that are in HR or human resources, I'm telling them now that what we're going to see over the next, not 20 years, not 15 years, not 10 years, but the next 5 years is the last of the baby boom cohort.
This is Coming of Age, Meeting the Needs of Our Aging Population, a podcast about how we can better support our seniors. I'm your host, Donna Duncan. I am also the CEO of the Ontario Long-Term Care Association, which represents about 70% of long-term care homes in Ontario, Canada. This episode was generously sponsored by our sector champion, Plan A, powered by StaffStat. Plan A, powered by StaffStat, is the only staffing strategy in Canada focused specifically on seniors' care. It marries people and culture to innovation to help long-term care and retirement homes optimize their staffing. Learn more about their mission to ensure senior care organizations across Canada have access to a strategy that keeps their frontline employees supported and their residents safe and cared for. Visit www.jointheateam.com. Welcome back to a new episode of Coming of Age. As the first baby boomers soon turn 80, we are already seeing the growth in the number of caregiver employees in workplaces across Canada and around the world. Caregiving responsibilities include short-term care, such as supporting a family member through surgery, and long-term care to support loved ones with chronic illnesses such as heart failure and dementia, both at home and in more specialized living and care settings, such as long-term care. The presence of caregivers in the workplace is not new. The role of parents in the workplace has long been recognized and supported, and never more so than today. What is changing is the proportion of people balancing care and work today as they support both their children and aging parents with increasing needs. The number of people taking on these roles is only growing, and with smaller families, the demands on them are greater than ever before. Today, the Ontario Caregiver Organization's annual survey documents that 1 of 2 caregivers in Ontario, families, friends, neighbors, is feeling burnt out as they provide untold hours of unpaid care to their older loved ones whose needs are increasing. We need to find new ways of supporting working caregivers on this journey. In today's episode, we've invited a panel of experts to explore opportunities for society and individuals to achieve more balance between caring for loved ones and managing careers and workplace commitments. Our episode guests today include Pedro Antunes, the Chief Economist of the Conference Board of Canada, where he provides insights on economic indicators about Canada, its regions and sectors. Pedro brings insight into how caregiver employee challenges will affect the Canadian economy, workplaces, and employers. Nora Spinks is a nationally and internationally recognized leader and innovator in individual, family, and organizational well-being. Nora has the rare ability to balance big picture and strategic thinking with a roll-up-your-sleeves approach to getting things done. As CEO of Work-Life Harmony Enterprises, Nora is a sought-after consultant and advisor on policy development and organization development. Finally, we are joined by Allison Williams, a professor in the School of Geography and Earth Sciences at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. A health geographer by training, Dr. Williams currently leads a Healthy Productive Work Partnership grant funded by the Canadian Institute for Health Research and Workplaces. Let's dive in. Welcome, everybody. It is such a delight to be starting today's discussion on caregivers and aging and the workplace and the impact that the aging demographic is having on people who have jobs, but are also having to care for a loved one. We know that the population over 80 is going to increase exponentially over the next 15 years. We know that there are extraordinary pressures on our healthcare system. This has huge implications in the face of workforce challenges for the people who are family caregivers, informal caregivers, a family member, a neighbor, a friend. Pedro, from the Conference Board of Canada, the Conference Board has commissioned a number of reports over the years. In 2017, there was a publication on the costs of long-term care and the need to move forward with building out the infrastructure of long-term care. We saw devastating consequences in 2020 with the Conference Board of Canada again saying now's the time to build long-term care. But you've also done a number of studies as well on caregivers in the workforce. And I'm just wondering, as a level set, if perhaps you could comment on where we were and what are some of the lessons learned?
Yeah, I think Canada's aging demography is a problem that continues to bite in two ways. One is that, of course, we're essentially seeing people leaving the workforce, and there's that challenge of people leaving the workforce, the baby boomer cohort retiring, and thus generating less economic activity. And I like to remind people that economic activity or GDP is really just income. It's income that's attributed to when we essentially employ people and when we employ capital, that generates income. And income, by the way, is what drives government revenues and what drives our ability to provide services to households. So that's the first challenge. And the second challenge, of course, is the aging demography is just entering its most expensive years in terms of demand for healthcare, all sorts of healthcare, obviously, including long-term care. People are living longer lives, and that's great. In some cases, they're living healthier lives, but in other cases, we're also seeing the number of people with, for instance, dementia growing in numbers more quickly than the population numbers on their own. So this tells us that there's a challenge that's just budding in terms of our need to supply services and long-term care for our aging, not yet baby boomers, but they're getting there, and they're going to add to that problem. Because we do economic forecasts, we look at both the income side of the economy and what that's driving in terms of revenues and the challenges with demography on healthcare. And just to give you an example, we talked about that demand, that report that we did in 2017. It's a bit dated, so I don't want to quote too many numbers out of that. But we were talking about current demand in 2017 of around 263,000 beds nationwide for long-term care, and that number growing to by 199,000, nearly 200,000 new long-term care beds needed by 2035. So that gives you a sense of almost the doubling of the need for long-term care. And that's with pretty solid assumptions around the take-up of a home care for this cohort that's going to be needing that care. So that's just one example. And I guess the other piece that I think is really important is since then, we've come through a very tough economic period. The pandemic has added massively to our debt load. And I know that we often discount and we often hear from our federal government that we're in good shape relative to other economies in terms of our debt and our ability to fund program spending. But I think we're comparing ourselves to a lot of economies that are also in a lot of trouble in terms of debt financing. So there's a challenge here. We need to be efficient. We need to deliver healthcare more effectively. And it's been a long road around delivering healthcare more efficiently and more effectively. And we're not seeing that at all in the numbers yet. Healthcare is a funny industry in the sense that when we have innovations in healthcare, often they add to our ability to deliver quality, but also it adds to the costs. And that's what we've seen historically. So we need to look at this issue carefully because we just can't afford it, I think, going forward.
It's a great point. On this podcast, we've had many discussions about the fact that governments around the world have known that this demographic shift was going to be happening since 1945. And yet here we are today, and Canada very much is not alone in this situation. So, Nora, you've worn many hats over the last decades as a thought leader in seniors and family care and social policy. I'd welcome your reflections, as you've just got such a depth of experience. So where are we today, and where have we been?
Well, let's just do a compare and contrast between caring for seniors and caring for children for a quick second. When my grandmother was in the paid labor force, the day she became engaged to be married, she was escorted off the property and given a silver tea set. When my mother was in the paid labor force at the same manufacturing facility, she was welcome to stay once she was married, but the minute she became pregnant with her first child, she was escorted off the property and given a silver tea set. When I had my first, we had maternity benefits. And so I was welcome to stay, I was welcome to go on leave, and I was welcomed back when I returned. By the time my son was an expectant parent, he had access to parental leave. His family had access to up to 18 months of financial assistance and income replacement related to providing care for my grandchildren. If we compare that with caring for seniors, what was available for my grandmother, my mother, and me in providing care for older generations and adults, not much has changed in comparison. So we have a little bit of compassionate care benefit. We have a little bit of community services and supports, but we don't have the same kind of massive public policy change that we've seen with respect to caring for children. And so when Pedro talks about it being a huge problem, I can't agree more, but I also think that we need to look at the glass from the other perspective as well. And it's also a huge opportunity if we choose to embrace it. Aging populations, we now have people in the community. We have people leaving the workforce that creates job opportunities for young people and for immigrants. We have people available to provide care. And we know that if we can delay the premature move to long-term care facilities by providing home care and community care and providing those kinds of supports, we can delay some of the demand and pressure on the long-term care system that gives us some time to catch up, because we got a lot of catching up to do, as Pedro so eloquently stated. But we have to recognize that seniors are more than just biological beings that need health care and a roof over their heads, but they're social beings, and that we need to ensure that not only do they receive care, but they also are treated with respect and honor and dignity and aren't just bed fillers. And that we need to look at long-term care in a really holistic approach as we learn from the past and start preparing for the future, because that future, as Pedro said, is coming at us very, very quickly.
Yeah, it really is sobering. As how are we going to respond when we think about how countries responded to the baby boomers' arrival and some of the post-war activity around building housing, building temporary spaces for universities? I recall former president of the University of Toronto talking about the Quonset huts on the campus of U of T to accommodate the influx of new students, and the sense of urgency with which governments were responding. Allison, you think about the geography of this. Canada is a vast country. I was recently at a conference with municipal leaders, and we were hearing from leaders in rural communities that they had seen an influx of older people into their local communities, arriving without their physicians, arriving without their family members. As we think about the needs of this growing demographic in rural and remote communities, and recognizing that in many cases their caregivers did not come, their family members are not with them, what are some of the observations and issues and opportunities that you see in your research?
Thanks very much for the question, Donna. I wanted to first mention the importance of what both Pedro and Nora have spoken about with respect to this being a tsunami going forward. with respect to how we're going to best manage the care of our aging population. At McMaster University, we did an interesting study that looked at the trajectory of maternity and paternity leave policies in the hopes that that would too be the trajectory that we follow in providing unpaid care to elderly family members. But as it hasn't happened, irrespective of the evidence that has been accrued over time about the need for carers to in fact be supported in this important role, particularly given we have smaller family sizes. We have the greatest number of women in the workforce than ever before, and we have increased mobility with respect to family members due to employment. When we talk specifically about rural and remote areas of the country, we're really primarily talking about areas which unfortunately start with vulnerability in that they're often medically underserved to start. So they have a shortage of hospital and clinical facilities. They also generally have a shortage of specialist care with, for example, nurse practitioners and GPs taking on a greater load of responsibility in managing, for example, geriatric issues. So the unique challenges in rural and remote areas, unfortunately, start with that hiccup. As a consequence, communities living in rural and remote areas generally are very untraditional with respect to how they thread the pieces of care together, often using very creative methods in employment of minimal resources. The other thing we know about these rural and remote communities is that, unfortunately, many of the healthcare professionals who do work in these geographies are, as I mentioned, often wearing multiple hats and playing multiple roles. They unfortunately often experience high burnout rates. There's been a real intentionality with many training institutions, such as those in medically underserved areas, such as Thunder Bay, Ontario, and Sault Ste. Marie and Sudbury. These are locations here in the province to really recruit local folks into their med schools and their nursing programs in order that they have the social support network available to them, and they are more likely to be retained within these communities as well.
That's so helpful and very insightful as you think about communities together. We were speaking on an earlier podcast with someone from Australia, and so often we're hearing about models in Scandinavia and some of the Nordic countries, but you're dealing with high density. And some of those models don't translate necessarily to the geography of Ontario and Canada. So thinking about how those communities respond to the needs of a shifting demographic is really, really insightful. So, Pedro, Nora commented on some of the progress we've made over time. I love the parallel, Nora, between childcare and seniors care as we think about how we're meeting the needs. Allison is demonstrating how the demands are increasing, but also requiring different responses in different communities. From a national lens and the work that you and your team have been doing, what are the trends that you're seeing with respect to employees heading into retirement?
That challenge that we talked about more broadly around the labor market and the demand for more healthcare, including caregiving, when we look at essentially folks that are providing care while working, this is in fact such a large piece of what we need to look at. Often we think of long-term care as long-term care homes and the number of beds required. But I think that what we're very aware of these days is how much care is being given by essentially working adults. And just some of the numbers around that, it's roughly around a quarter of working adults are providing care. Women are disproportionately providing care in terms of number of hours, but it's both men and women are actively providing care to aging adults that are in need of care. So this is that dual problem. And I'd like to take you back to the baby boom cohort. And just if we look at the labor market pressures, and essentially the baby boom cohort is one that is not yet in their 80s. And most of the baby boomers, in fact, are the late boomers, and they're still very much in the workforce. For the last 12 years or so, what we've seen is that starting of the retirement of the early boomers, which are now exiting or have exited the workforce. And we've seen that reflected in terms of labor market pressures. And when I talk to folks that are in HR or human resources, I'm telling them now that what we're going to see over the next, not 20 years, not 15 years, not 10 years, but the next 5 years is the last of the baby boom cohort. The youngest baby boomers are aged just under 60, and they're still, as I said, very much in the workforce. So we're going to see that pressure in terms of the number of retirements. The other dual edge of the sword here is that, well, yes, these folks are obviously the baby boom cohort entering their 80s, and we've talked about the number of people that are going to be demanding more healthcare, demanding more long-term care. And I think there's some stats around that we'll see essentially the number of people that are in their 80s or over 80 go from 1.8 million to 2.5 million in just a span of about 10 years or so. That's a massive number, but it's going to continue to grow. The other issue, of course, is that as we need to care for these people, we're going to see more people not just retire out of the workforce, but take time off or leave to take care of these folks. And so we need to be able to support that. We need to be flexible, ensuring that these folks have the ability to continue to give care and stay in the labor force. And for years and years, as the baby boomers have retired, I've heard from essentially employers about how they're going to do their best to retain and attract older workers. Now we have to focus on doing our best to retain and attract caregiver workers. I think that's going to be a really important HR issue going forward. In terms of that labor market, in a sense, good news for workers, good news for those that have to give care, because I think there's going to be more and more attention paid to that from an employer perspective.
It's such a great point, and you've touched on some of the comments Nora had made earlier around it's an issue, but it's also an opportunity. So, Nora, if this is a case we're all in this together and no one sector can address the issues of aging, caregiving, and labor shortages, and that paradigm of long-term care as this physical building or box where people go as a destination, from your experience and the work that you've been doing over the years, what's that new anchor today that will get us there for tomorrow, knowing what's coming?
We've all talked about this being a very complex dilemma that we all have to figure out how to manage. It's not a simple problem that we can just solve and then we can say we've done it. And I think Pedro's painted a really vibrant picture of what the future holds. When we look at it through a family lens, there's also the reality of the shrinking family. And you layer that on top of what Pedro's talking about, and we're anticipating about 30% fewer family caregivers available, and they're the ones that provide the vast majority of the care as people age. And so we have to look at it from the perspective of the caregiver and the care receiver. We have to look at it in terms of the type of care, and then we have to look at it from the perspective of the work. So when we think about the work and care equation, we have to look at both sides. So the care, we have to look at the intensity and duration. So oftentimes when we think about care, we think about things like intensive, long-term, over time, getting worse, progressive, things like Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia. But where work and care tend to come into conflict are around all kinds of care. So it might be intensive and short-term, like you're looking after a spouse who's just coming out of surgery, or you might be looking after a parent who's just having some kind of treatment, and it's intense, but it's short-term. And then 6 months from now or a year from now, you might need a completely different kind of accommodation in the workplace. So we have to look at intensity and duration of care. When we look at the work side of the work equation, work and care equation, we have to look at what kind of work it is. Is it a job? Is it a career? Is it a gig work? Is it with a small employer? Are you self-employed? Or are you part of a large organization with union protection? because the solutions and strategies are very, very different across each of those environments. So if you're in a big employer, you might have policies around things like alternative flex or agile work. You might have options for alternative career paths and career breaks with off ramps and on ramps when you need to provide care. And you may be able to adjust your workload. If you're in a small workplace, you might not have policies, but you may have practices. So if you need some flexibility, go take care of mom, go take dad to the doctor. We'll flex together as a team. But then there's more formal structures like career customization, where you dial up and dial down your pace of work, your workload, your scheduling, and the role that you play. Are you an independent contributor or are you a people team leader? So there's a whole range of ways to look at the work and care equation when we're trying to come up with next stage, next generation program services and supports in the workplace and in the community. One simple thing would be to make it possible to take people to doctor's appointments outside of core business hours. Pretty simple solution. Being able to do those kinds of things on evenings and weekends would make it way easier to balance work and family. We're not seeing that happening in the near future.
And it really does speak to what can that collective response be as we rethink how we respond as a society. Think of the burden on our primary care providers and how they work and the shortage of primary care providers in communities across the province, including urban centers. The pressure on our hospital system. Ours has been a very medical-oriented society in terms of how we support people as they age. Allison, you've been studying caregiving in rural and northern communities. We've seen some of the greatest creativity in places like Thunder Bay, Ontario, Canada. We've seen a lot of innovation. What do you see as the unique opportunities for employees, families, and caregivers and care receivers outside of our urban centers?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. I think with respect to the specific experience of urban and remote, in contrast to urban, around carer-friendly workplaces, as they're often called, we recognize that the rural and the remote areas are generally experiencing a greater degree of social cohesion and social capital. So as a consequence, there might be a better understanding of the needs of individual care employees, and consequently, potentially more personal support provided. I was just at the mechanics yesterday in a rural area where I'm currently living. And one of the clients came into the garage and was getting some work done on their car. And the mechanic came out and they had a 20-minute conversation about caring for mom, the mechanic's mom, who was diagnosed with a life-threatening illness. And they had probably a 2-minute conversation about the car, which really speaks about, again, that sense of community and that intentionality around community in many rural and remote areas. But what we know generally about care-friendly workplaces is that they're going to increasingly be central, given what Pedro had mentioned. We had some work done recently with the Canadian General Social Survey, which is a Stats Canada product. And the analysis showed that the cost of replacing the unpaid care work done by care employees annually is $51.5 billion. So it has a significant impact on our economy. We also know that there's a number of predictors at risk care employees, meaning those care employees who have poor work-life balance and who potentially will leave the labor force. And they include providing more hours of unpaid care, that is more than 10 hours of unpaid care per week. Also caring for someone with cancer, mental health or addictions. Also caring for a spouse or a partner, and caring for someone living in supportive housing. So these are some of the predictors for at-risk care employees who generally experience negative health outcomes. Usually it's the mental health that shows up first with respect to anxiety and depression. And then unfortunately, there's some physical health outcomes that follow. There's also, again, a number of financial and emotional consequences of trying to balance paid work and unpaid care roles, as well as the consequence of leaving the workforce or, again, dropping down from full-time work to either part-time or casual work. But the problem with dropping out of the workforce is not only are these care employees losing a salary and often a pension and the various benefits that come with full-time work, but they're often losing their sense of meaning, sense of belonging. They're often losing their social support system as well as their social network. So it really is quite an unhealthy activity to actually leave the workforce, not only for the country, but for these individual care employees. From an employer's perspective, losing the most experienced and well-trained workforce is, as Pedro mentioned, highly problematic. We know care employees are generally over the age of 45, so they are the most experienced and most well-trained workforce, and clearly not a workforce that you want to lose. Our research has also shown that employers who, in fact, create and build care-friendly workplaces also experience reduced absenteeism, reduced disability costs, reduced employee turnover, as well as increased workforce productivity. They also have a more engaged workforce. They have a greater retention rate and an increased competitive advantage. They also have a reduction in the number of employees coming to work sick. So there's a significant set of advantages to putting in place care-friendly supports, as Nora had introduced, whether that be flexibility, whether that be shared work options, whether that be short or long-term paid or unpaid leaves. Again, as Nora mentioned, these are often very tailored strategies that are very much dependent upon the type of paid work being done as well as the type of unpaid care work expected outside of work. McMaster University, together with the Canadian Standards Association, built a care inclusive and accommodating workplace standard in 2017, as well as an implementation guide in 2018. And these two documents are available for free download on the Canadian Standards Association website. And these are basically guidelines that provide employers, HR departments, as well as care employees themselves, a set of strategies to build care-friendly workplaces, irrespective of whether or not they're caring for an adult child, such as an autistic child with a disability, or whether or not they're caring for elderly family members, whether they be spouses, family members, neighbors, or friends. And this download, again, speaks to the complementary nature of these sources, not only on the CSA website, but also on our Care-Friendly Workplace website at McMaster University, where we have dozens of free downloads from occupational health and safety posters through to strategies for negotiating agreements at the table when unions are renegotiating agreements. So again, all sorts of free available resources for employers to not only think about how to create care-friendly workplaces, but actually implement them and then monitor their success.
Yeah, that's great, Allison. And we'll be sure to add some links to the conference board reports as well as links that Allison's spoken about. So, Pedro, given the various reports the Conference Board of Canada has done, Nora has really framed, I think, so eloquently that more of a biopsychosocial landscape where the traditional paradigms are more collapsing on themselves. And Allison has built on that and from a context of geography, given the geographic reality that is Canada. We at the Long-Term Care Association, we're working very aggressively with our provincial government, but even more so than ever before in encouraging municipal governments to support the rebuilding and increasing capacity of our more structured, more formalized traditional long-term care. We do recognize that long-term care is more now. It's long-term care in the home. It's long-term care and assisted living. It's home care. It's longer-term care in hospitals. So we're seeing the majority of our admissions into long-term care in Ontario actually coming directly from hospitals. So the notion of those community admissions of the past really aren't there anymore because we have people staying in home longer with higher acuity needs. We believe there is a cost, a socioeconomic cost of not building out services and the pressure that the lack of that more structured care is going to have on families, on businesses, on other social services, and the workplace. As you look to the future, what should governments be thinking about from a policy framework as we contemplate the response given the pressure on our health workforce, given the aging demographic?
Well, Donna, I think first of all, we need a better understanding of the depth of the problem. And I think I need to get together with Nora and Allison, and we need to do a deeper study that encompasses all of those pieces that we've been talking about to get a better sense of the return on investment. We've heard some of the issues here, the broader issues that we need to contemplate. The social survey from Stats Canada is getting upgraded with more in-depth analysis on essentially home care. I think we're realizing that there's that problem at hand, and we need to better understand what the consequences are, both in terms of costs with the different ailments that our aging demography is going to have and the time required to provide care. We talked about that $51 billion worth of home care that's given by workers today. That's, by the way, very close to 2% of our total GDP, our total income in the economy. And in terms of perspective, the federal government spends, I think, north of $300 billion roughly a year. So it just gives you a sense of the size of that $51 billion relative to our total public purse at the federal level, at least. I think, first of all, that deeper analysis needs to be done to get a better understanding of that return on investment. And we've just put in place a daycare program that's going to cost, I think, when it's fully played out, around $9 billion a year. And despite the fact that we are in a difficult fiscal situation and the conference board is worried about our ongoing deficits, we think that this is a worthy program because it pays off. And in fact, we think the $10 daycare will pay for itself because it enables greater labor force participation, especially for women, and that drives the economy and the income side. Essentially, this program pretty much pays for itself. We need that kind of analysis in terms of supporting the working daycare providers. Now, so that's the more research that needs to be done to make the case that we need to do this. And then the return on investment for businesses, I think that's going to become self-evident. What we need to do is encourage businesses with various tax credits, subsidies. We need to encourage home givers and support home givers with subsidies and tax credits. And I think Allison and Nora are probably much more, because policy is hard. And you need to dig into the details to be able to know what can be effective, what are the hang-ups and the problems that people face. It's a broader wellness issue, I think, that we need to provide. And I think it should be provided at the employer level, but supported by the federal government. The other thing the federal government or provincial and federal and municipal governments can do is be leaders in adopting wellness programs that can address these issues. In terms of my kind of knowledge and experience, probably more broadly, I think, and we've talked about this, flexibility matters most. I think flexibility is really important. We talked about paid leave, flexible work hours. We talked about being able to provide services outside of regular work hours, compressed work week. I remember prior to the pandemic, there was a lot of talk about job sharing, and we haven't seen a lot of that. I know in Europe, it was something that was working out. And I think these are flexible options that we need to consider as employers going forward. The other thing that I think is really important, and we haven't talked a lot about today, is technology. First of all, Canada is a knowledge economy. We still have our resources, we still have our manufacturing, but where the growth has been is in the knowledge sector. And that provides us an advantage in terms of being able to work from home, deliver healthcare, deliver home care to our loved ones in a way that is more flexible just on the technology side. And again, when I think about helping folks that are unable to provide care because of their current jobs, I think of educational programs that may get them to a level where they can find work that enables them to work from home. Allison made the point around who's providing that care. It's the older workers in the workforce that provide care to their family members that are aging. And those folks are very productive. They're very knowledgeable. They earn high incomes. We need to be aware of what's happening there. It's not just the retiring baby boomers. We need to keep those folks in the workforce. So I'll leave it at that. I think to answer your question very succinctly, we need to do more work. And I defer to Nora and Allison on the kind of details of the best kinds of programs to address this issue specifically.
That's a great anchor for us to think about as we contemplate the future, the role of technology without losing those warm hands, the role of education and training, how we structure our programs and build competencies, perhaps in a different kind of way. Allison, as we think about the increase in the number of people who are going to be balancing caregiving and work in the coming years, and Pedro, I think really you and Nora and Allison have all talked about the need for flexibility, for different approaches to how we provide care, but also how employers need to respond. Allison, what would be the one thing you would like our listeners to think about and talk about?
Well, in the ideal world, the standard that I referred to earlier, which is currently a voluntary standard, would be required. If it were a required standard, then employers would have no option but to look at this issue and pay attention to it in a way that supports and enhances the needs of care employees. When we look at the three communities in which care employees exist, they exist within a community, a residential community, as does their care recipient. And what we know is that many of those community resources are no longer available. A lot of them are just simply no longer there. We've seen the volunteer sector basically dissipate. When we look at, again, our public government supports, they're not getting any greater. In fact, they're not even meeting the current demand. And so inevitably, the care is going to fall on these unpaid carers. So the only bastion left is the workplace. I mentioned earlier, smaller family sizes, more women in the workforce than ever before in the history of Canada, increased mobility due to work. So the employer is really the only stronghold that has the capacity to support these care employees to continue engaging in paid employment while also balancing unpaid care work. And it's by making this voluntary standard a requirement of all employers that we will have the unions, the occupational health and safety committees, that we're having the human resource professionals build the competencies required in order to best support these care employees within the workforce. And it also recognizes the importance of how we need to change the culture of the workplace. It's okay for us to talk about our kids. It's okay for us to talk about our spouses, but it's still not completely okay for us to talk about our elder care responsibilities. So we need to change the culture of our workplace to ensure that this is a comfortable issue that allows us to self-identify as care employees and consequently be able to request the supports that we need. And this also speaks to the issue of the coworker support. If everybody was cognizant of the fact that care employees exist at work and need specific supports in order for them to balance unpaid care and paid work, then coworkers would likely be more supportive of one another, recognizing that we're all going to be in this position of providing unpaid care, if not once, multiple times throughout our our work lives.
Well said, Allison. One of the recurring themes on our podcast over the last 3 years has been ageism. And we could get into a whole discussion around the fear of aging and why perhaps decision makers haven't invested in the appropriate supports for an aging demographic. But we invest in what we value. And so really looking forward to sharing that standard with our listeners. So Nora, the last word to you. What is your wish as we think about the future and the possibilities of supporting our carers and supporting our aging demographic?
So to answer that question succinctly, I have to provide a little bit of frame and perspective that I use when I think about caregiving and work. The first is most of us are in the paid labor force or employed in some way, shape, or form. All of us will receive and give care at least once during our lifetime and at least once during our working years. That we are all getting older one day at a time. The alternative's not so great. So we need to embrace aging. We need to celebrate aging. We need to see it as a gift to our communities and to our families and to our workplaces, and not a burden, an issue, a problem, a crisis. All of that negative framing puts us in this position where we treat seniors and older persons in our community with less dignity and respect that they deserve. So that's the framing. The one thing I think that we need to do, and we've touched on a little bit during our conversation today, is innovation and creativity. And innovation and creativity in public policy, in workplace policy and practice. So, for example, the federal government just very recently in June of 2023 introduced a brand new multi-generational housing renovation credit. This is where people who own a home, and yes, it's only for that population, can now access a renovation credit for up to $50,000 to renovate their homes to accommodate multi-generational living. Very innovative, creative, new program for the federal government. We are seeing lots of innovation in housing and supportive housing and alternative housing. We're seeing lots of innovation in the workplace in terms of how we work, where we work, when we work, what gets paid. Lots of creativity and innovation in leaves and benefits and supports in the workplace and in the community. But I think the one thing that we need to put a little bit more emphasis on in terms of innovation and creativity is how we support and incite businesses, employers, small, medium, and large, to, first of all, recognize caregiving employees, support them, and recognize that when they support the caregivers in our communities, they're actually supporting our communities. The cost of replacing working caregivers in the community is way higher than supporting them to provide that care to their loved ones or family, friends, neighbors. And so we need to come up with innovative, creative ways to incentivize and to recognize and to celebrate those employers and small workplaces and large employers and unions who are putting these issues at the forefront of their activities and their efforts. It would be great if 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, we're not still talking about, gee, there are a lot of people who are reaching the age of 80 or 90, and something should be done. Creativity and innovation can begin today, it can begin now, and it begins with each and every one of us. In our roles as caregivers, in our roles as employers, in our roles as employees.
Well said, Nora. And that date that the conference board had identified in its much earlier reports around 2035 is coming far more quickly than any of us realized. To your point, we're aging one day at a time, and it certainly feels a lot faster than that at times. We never thought that it would take a pandemic to be a catalyst for these types of discussions, to shine a light on the importance of caregivers in the workforce, to shine a light on aging, to have these discussions around building communities and reframing this, because at the end of the day, it is all about people and how we come together collectively to problem solve. I really want to thank you, Nora, Pedro, and Allison. It has been a privilege to have you join us today. Thank you for listening to Coming of Age, the podcast that is changing the conversation on seniors' care and aging. We hope this episode brings a new perspective and inspires you to continue the conversation with your colleagues, friends, and family. Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast so that more listeners will join our community of changemakers in seniors' care. Until next time, I'm your host, Donna Duncan. Keep well.